Today's show is sponsored by my friends over at Flint Custom Hats. All of their hats are handmade right here in Lubbock, Texas, and every felt hat I wear is made by Flint. You can check them out and order your own hat at flinthat.com. I'd like to kick off today's show with a poem written by today's guest, Andy Wilkinson. The poem is from Andy's 1994 album, Charlie Goodnight, and it's titled, Saddling Up Time. I never looked forward to the end of the day, or to evening drab and melancholy gray, or to featureless shadows of purple to black, or to work finished up or simply put back while the business of living slowly unwinds. I was always awaiting for saddling up time. I slept of necessity, not pleasure, and not for the comforts of night when the bosom of God cradled mortality in immortal dark, nor for the shroud of cool starlight whose spark like the lamp of the firefly silently chimed. I took my pleasure in saddling up time. And I worried the hectic commotion of morn, the commerce of mercantile and courthouse lawn, the meetings and greetings on sidewalk and street where horseback opinions and auguring meet, and argued their rhythms, swore at their rhymes, but was playful as a pup, come saddling up time. For 'twas then, before ever light angled to fill the round corners, we'd clamor like wolves at the kill. With horse talk our yap, with our nip and our bite, latigo leathers snapping cinches down tight, in the summer's wet dew or the winter's sharp rime, as we readied our horses at saddling up time. When the morning night air was marble, we breathed heavy and smooth and as cold as the breeze that skitters across the new snow-covered plains. One hand on the horn and the other the reins, we stepped aboard stirrups, young bucks in our prime, salty as the pecos at saddling up time. Though I've lived for this moment most all of my life, beginnings, not endings, put the edge on my knife. I've cursed too damn much, and I've never prayed well, and it may be God figures to send me to hell, riding drag for the devil, to pay for my crimes. But I'm damned if I'll go for saddling up time. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Andy Wilkinson. Mr. Wilkinson is a poet, a songwriter, a playwright, and a storyteller. He's the artist in residence at the Southwest Collection at Texas Tech University, where he also teaches songwriting in the School of Music and Creative Process in the Honors College. I sat down with Mr. Wilkinson in his office at the Southwest Collection, and we visited about the life and importance of his distant uncle, Charlie Goodnight. Here's Andy Wilkinson.
Charlie Goodnight was born on the eve of the birth of Texas. He was born in 1936, born in Illinois. Part of a small family. The father died. His father, who was also Charles Goodnight, died, and his mother remarried to what proved to be a scoundrel. by some accounts, the family was run out of that part of Illinois. By this time, it was 1845. Texas had become part of the United States, or they were on the verge of it. And so there was a lot of in-migration to Texas, and a lot of it from Illinois. One time, Illinois, southern Illinois, was the furthest west of most civilization, quote civilization, Anglo people from back east. And so there was a lot of migration from southern Illinois down into Texas, and that included that clan that had once been Goodnights. When they got to Texas, part of the shenanigan that had caused them to get thrown out of southern Illinois was that the stepfather had been carrying on a relationship with the oldest of his stepdaughters, and Goodnight would never talk about it much, but he did say that in his interviews with J. Evans Haley in the 1930s or 1920s, that his mother divorced his stepfather for good reason. And of course we know that in those years, in the 1840s, a divorce was a pretty unusual happenstance. And so the family, they wound up on the Brazos River, but down near Waco. So Goodnight began growing up there. And his mother at some point remarried to a good guy, a fellow named Sheik, S-H-E-K, who also had some family, as was pretty common also for that time. And Wes Sheik, who would have been a step-brother to Goodnight, became very close. The two of them became very close. And they, as young boys, began to help raise cattle. And in that time, there was not a term cowboy, and if it was used in a sexually pejorative way about some boy who would have his romance with a cow. So it was not you call somebody that, you'd start a fight. What people who worked cattle were called was cowmen. And also there wasn't a ranch. They were what we would call today stock farmers. They were people that were doing all kinds of things to make a living. And so Wes and Charlie worked for a fellow named Varner, who was a good guy, as well as this sheik that Charlie's mother married. And Varner allowed them to, at the same time they were working his cows, they were able to acquire some cattle of their own, and so they began to build a small herd. And they wound up relocating to the Cross Timbers, which was the next point west. We think of that today as a little north of Weatherford, a little north of Mineral Wells, in that region. Cross Timbers went on up almost into Oklahoma. Cross Timbers meaning it was essentially a patch of scrub mesquite and oak that was like a kind of a forest island out in that big part of the country before you got up to the plains to the west, or down south to the breaks that led down to the southern end of the plains. And so it was a formidable place to cross, all the brush. It was hard to move wagons, and it was also, the Comanche were very active, and so that was it was their country. It was a tough spot. But so they moved out there. The Civil War comes along, and Goodnight, along with a lot of other young men on the frontier there, the Cross Timbers frontier, weren't that inclined to fight in the Civil War, because they had enough of a fight going on trying to keep their homesteads and their cattle from depredations by the Comanche, but also from plenty of white thieves and scoundrels that would also rustle the cattle. And so Charlie joined the Texas Rangers, which was one way to do your military service. It was kind of like the National Guard, I guess we'd think of it today. But they would go on patrol as an official part of the state of Texas now. And their job mainly was to patrol that frontier for the Comanche. It was a very difficult time. The Comanche were very bright as well as very aggressive, and it was, after all, their place. They knew that the Civil War was going on, and so they stepped up their activity along that frontier line. And in fact, there's a term that historians use. They call it the perforated frontier. Some people will say the frontier line fell back almost to Fort Worth, but that's not quite true. There pockets of it still remained out to the west, and so it was this kind of ragged territory. When they did work cows, they worked them in an interesting way. There weren't any fences of any kind that we think about. The phrase was, "Salt makes the best fence," and they'd put out a salt block. The cattle would stay close to that, and then they would try to, in the spring, sort of like anybody else would, they'd round them up to get the new calves and the mamas. It was a very difficult job. Those cattle it was long before the term longhorn came along, which is much, much later. They were called Texas cattle, and they were descendants of the Criollo cattle had been brought from Spain. Criollo had these long, almost straight horns that were kind of spiraled. And the Texas cattle began to develop the same kind of horns that we associate with longhorns. And they were like the longhorn. They were rangy and fairly tall, not heavy-set beef kind of cattle that we're used to today. But the main thing was they were meaner than snakes. It was widely believed that it was preferable to come across a bear to coming across one of these Texas cattle with calf. So you had to be tough to handle those cattle. So they went through the war. Charlie also had he had a brother-in-law, Alfred Lane, that is my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, because he married Charlie's older sister, Elizabeth, to whom Charlie was very close. Charlie was not so close to his older brother, Elijah. My own supposition is that he faulted Elijah for not having maybe killed that stepfather that was such a scoundrel. And it's also well known that Goodnight didn't like to sleep indoors. Not only does Haley talk about that in his biography, Charles Goodnight, Cowman and Plainsman, but Laura V. Hamner, who wrote a children's, it was intended for the children's educational market about Goodnight, called Charles Goodnight, the No Gun Man of Texas, no-gun, because of his having given up firearms once the Panhandle got to be settled, and feeling like that the only way they could build a civilization was to quit packing their iron. But in her book and in Haley's book, they both talk about Goodnight never wanting to sleep indoors, and there's some speculation that has to do with it. That's something he developed as a kid, having to put up with that circumstance in their household. The stepfather, Dougherty, and that older sister moved off and married. Charlie and his mother and Wes and the new stepfather, Mr. Sheik, all moved out to the Cross Timbers, to a place today we call Oran, O-R-A-N. Already out there was Oliver Loving and his family. They spent that Civil War time, working their cattle and going after the Comanche, or responding to the Comanche attacks on the settlements. And at the close of the war, when the South lost, there was a lot of despondency in Texas over that. For one thing, Texas was poor to start with. I mean, it had been poor from day one. That's one of the reasons it went ahead and joined the Union in 1845, is because it was broke. Not much infrastructure, not much capital investment, and through the war it had gotten worse. The Confederacy, because it was also poor, was not only given to impressing people into service, what we would call a draft, but they would also seize cotton, they'd seize cattle, other crops that might be raised, and they would pay for them, and I'm holding my fingers up to the tape recorder saying pay for them with two fingers like quotes around it, with Confederate script, which was worthless even then, but certainly worthless after the war. So there was this idea of, we're going to leave Texas, we're going to move to Mexico. And that's what Charlie Goodnight was going to do in 1865 after the war ended. Alfred Lane had already been killed by the Comanche during when they were moving some cows along the Brazos River as his brother-in-law. Before the war, Oliver Loving had pioneered a trail to Denver. When I say pioneer, that's not exactly right. There was already some kinds of trail. Loving knew that there was a market in Denver for cattle. Loving had been put under house arrest in Denver during the war, and it was kind of a curious house arrest. They were all friends, so even though Colorado was in the north, and here Oliver Loving was from the south, they wouldn't let him go back to Texas, but they didn't interfere with him writing letters, and he would write letters back saying, "If you'd send me 20 men, I can take this state." He was pretty confident about that. None of that ever happened. So he returns after the war. Charlie and Wes set out to go to Mexico, and Wes gets injured, and they have to come back. So there's no movement to Mexico. The next year, this is 1866, Goodnight decides that he's going to, instead of move to Mexico, he's going to collect some of these cows and take them up to Denver. And so he asks Oliver Loving if he would throw in with him. Their relationship was very interesting. It didn't last all that long because Loving was killed later, or died after being shot by arrows on the trail. Loving was a good bit older, and Goodnight had really never had a father figure. I mean, he was a little boy when his dad died. And so his relationship to Loving was not only as a partner, but very much a mentor and a father figure. And so it was quite interesting. Where did they get their cows? That's another interesting thing. Cattle business, the trail driving didn't really exist, although cattle had been driven to northern markets before the war. It was on everybody's mind to do that after the war. Again, Texas lost the war. There were all kinds of laws that were passed immediately by the North that restricted the ability of Southern men to, particularly if they had been served in the Confederate Army, laws that restricted their ability to borrow money, to own things, and you're dead broke after the war. I mean, you're pretty broke going into it, but dead broke afterwards. How in the world do you dig out of that? Which is a constant issue in human affairs when one country defeats another. Very few have been as smart as the Romans or as smart as we were after the Second World War, both in Germany and Japan, with our various plans to come up with a way for people to make a living. Texas was headed in a downward spiral. But there was this natural resource, and that is 4 years' worth of wild cattle that had no owners. And they were mean, they were tough, and you had to be capable of handling them to do anything with them. And if you could do something with them, then you could round them up and travel them north. I mean, it was not an easy thing to do. Loving knew where the markets were, so they pitched in together, and on June 6 of 1866, they set off on the first trail drive for what came to be known as the Goodnight-Loving Trail. Goodnight himself didn't like to use that term because he thought of it as Loving's trail first. Goodnight made a couple of additions to the trail. One is that instead of going north, you would normally go from Palo Pinto and today's Mineral Wells. You would have gone north on present-day 287 and head up through the Texas Panhandle and into eastern Colorado, across the Llano Estacado, and southern part of the High Plains, and on into Denver. But there were two problems with that. One is water was difficult to come by. The plains has no live water, and times during the spring or the summer you might have some playa lakes, places where you could water a herd, but not that many. So Goodnight proposed what he called taking roundins. They would go from Palo Pinto south down through by Fort Phantom Hill to Buffalo Gap, and then from Buffalo Gap down to the Concho at present-day San Angelo. And there they would pick up the Butterfield stage line route, or the California Trail it was called, but a well-known trail that went through that area and crossed a desert stretch of about 90 miles between the Concho and the Pecos River. And they had to go through another gap, Castle Gap, south of present-day Crane. And but there was water. There was water, little spots of water on that 90 miles, but certainly at the Concho. And then at the Pecos, all the water was salty, because the Pecos itself was a salty river. They at least had water that the cattle could drink. And then they would turn north and follow the Pecos through New Mexico. And that would take them up to Fort Sumner, which is where they first sold most of their cattle. But you could follow that on north then and go up on top near Roy, New Mexico today, and stay on the plains and come up. And at first they would go to the west over Raton Pass. But Dick Wooten, who controlled the pass on the Colorado side, the bottom of the pass on the north side, was charging like $1 a head or something, an enormous amount of money to let them go through. And he had an official dispensation from the territorial government to be able to do that. So after that first time they tried doing that, Goodnight came up with another route, which was through a very difficult pass called Trinchera Pass, which is north of Folsom, New Mexico. So this trail developed, and they were able to take these cattle. If they were tougher than the cattle were, they'd round them up, and after several days, maybe a week or two, they would get them what they call trail broke, so that they would be not quite so prone to stampede, and they could control them, and they would, take them to sell. The first buyer was at Fort Sumner was the U.S. Army, because they had imprisoned all these native peoples there, and they had nothing to feed them with. It was in a place where there wasn't a game. There certainly weren't buffalo left, or that many buffalo in that area. So they were able to sell what they had to the Army. Later, they would take them on north through Trinchera to present day west to east of present day Denver, to where a fellow named John Iliff would buy them and would park them there and then sell them off to mining camps and what have you. So it was a perfect business if you were tough enough to do it. You had to be smart, you had to be tough, but it was a hip pocket business. You didn't need a bank, you didn't need a credit line, you didn't need any kind of thing. If you were tough enough, you could do it, but you had to deal in cash, and you had to worry about attacks by the Comanche. The Red River Wars were still 10 years away from being finished. This is 1866.
That first drive in 66, how does that fit in the timeline of the other trails up north that were developing?
It was very early, and
was that the first?
No, I wouldn't say so. Because there were trails that happened before the war. Loving himself had taken some up to Chicago before the war. He had taken them up to Colorado, so it's not like they were the very first. It is the only one of the trails that went through wild country. The Chisholm Trail, the Northern Trail, the the American Trail. I think those are the big ones. To the east of the Goodnight-Loving Trail went through territory that was claimed and quote settled. And so their main issues were dealing with landowners. When they trample their cows through somebody's farm, or later on, this is way before barbed wire. Barbed wire didn't come till the mid-'70s. So it was a difficult trail. That said, it was such an attractive business that, and of course you only did it in the summer. No one started till late enough in the spring you weren't going to get caught by weather, and they finished up in time to avoid the weather in the fall. But it became sort of everybody said, man, this is like the gold rush. I can wrangle up some of those cattle and take them. And so after that first year, Goodnight would start the year with a herd that he would put together. But one of the things he would do to get his cattle was he would ride back. Once he got the herd trail broken, and he had his crew taking him north, he would ride back down the trail and find some poor shopkeeper or farm boy who had started up the trail with some cattle and was beside themselves and unable to take care of it. And Goodnight would purchase the herd and then himself take them up. So it was a really lucrative business and a very interesting business. As I said, it was cash, and so you're at risk from desperados, from thieves. Goodnight did a couple of things to avoid that. One is that he rode a mule. And then his horse also, gets a lot of controversy in today's world. Everybody says it's not so, but it's well documented that he rode a mare. That was his horse, and people say, well, you can't ride a mare, for all the reasons that they would posit. But Goodnight would actually ride the mule, and he trailed the horse behind him, so that if he was set on, or he had to get in a hurry, the mule was reliable but not very fast, so he could then mount his horse. The other thing he would do when he had money was that he would entrust it to Bose Eichard. Bose Eichard was a black cowpuncher, African-American cowpuncher, a freedman. And one of the cowboys that Goodnight valued probably more than any other. In fact, when Bose Eichard died, Goodnight paid for a headstone, and he was buried in Weatherford Cemetery, not far from where Loving was buried, which was pretty unusual, I think, for the time. Goodnight's reasoning was, first of all, that Eichard was honest and trustworthy and capable, but also that the whites, in their arrogance, if they attacked, and thieves to get the money, they would never believe that a black man would be carrying, $30,000 or $40,000, $50,000, and so that was one of the things that he did, which I thought was quite interesting. So Goodnight, Loving died in Fort Sumner as a result of gangrene that set in after it was over the winter. It had been a trail drive in the summer. Goodnight, as I said, he essentially idolized Loving, but he said he had a couple of faults, and one was that the main fault was that he absolutely knew no fear. And so he wanted to go out forward and try to find some markets when they were driving the herd. And Goodnight said, no, too many Comanche out through here. And Loving said, that's not an issue. I'm going to, he's going to go. So he went, he took a fellow with him that was one of the Goodnight's regular crew, a fellow named One-Arm Bill Wilson, who was also a brother-in-law of Goodnight's, not married to the Elizabeth, but to another sister. And Bill Wilson and Loving were attacked by Comanche along the Pecos River near present-day Lovington, if I remember that right. Those of you listening should check your J. Evetts Haley book and get this down for a fact. Loving was wounded and holed up along the river and sent Wilson to go for help, and so Wilson escaped by taking off all of his clothes and slipping down the river, and then got back to the trail, and some Mexican men who were traveling the trail, I'm not quite sure what they were doing, selling things, or they were, in any case, they were friendly. They came on to Bill Wilson, who was, sunburned and worse for the wear and tear. and got the story out from him. So they reunited Bill Wilson with One-Armed Bill with Goodnight in the herd. The Mexicans later found Loving, who was injured, and they were the ones who got him to Fort Sumner. Goodnight knew this when had pieced that together, and so he set off to go to Fort Sumner, and this is a really great story. Overnight rode right at 100 miles to Sumner from where he had learned this information on one of those mules, sleeping in the saddle when he had to, till he got to Fort Sumner and found Loving. Loving died, but before he died, he made Goodnight promise that he would continue their partnership, for the benefit of his family, and also that he would carry him back to be buried among his own people. And so that's another great story of where the following year, and when he died, they buried him. They go back the next year to take him, and so they exhume him and put him in the coffin. They put it in another box that, by some accounts, was covered with tin cans flattened out, and they put charcoal, left over from a fire, packed around it, probably for the odor, I would guess. And they carried Loving's body back to Weatherford. And there are folk stories that native people would see this procession, and they knew about it. And so they would all watch it go by in sort of a respectful way. And, I hope that's true. It just sounds like a great thing for one group of people to do for another. But so Goodnight had lost his partner and continued on through driving his cattle, and eventually settled in Pueblo. And he became very prosperous there. He helped build the first brick building, which was an opera house. He invested in a bank. He had a ranch. He built a barn, a really sturdy barn that's not so sturdy today, but still there. And then the Panic of 1873 came along. In between times, Goodnight had married Mary Ann Dyer and brought her out there. So they'd set up their home at this ranch to the west of present-day Pueblo. The Panic of 1873 wiped out banks, and the prices of cattle started plummeting. And Goodnight, believing in the worth of cattle, kept buying them. He bought them all the way down. And so now he had all these cows, and he had no money. He was dead broke. So he went back to what he knew, which was driving cattle. When he was with the Rangers, Texas Rangers, he became aware of the Llano Estacado. And he became, not only the Llano Estacado, but he became aware of the Paladero Canyon. And in his mind, that seemed to be a perfect place to have a ranch. So he was in the process of relocating from Pueblo, the Arkansas River Valley, to Paladero, which was interesting. The Paladero already had some occupants. Casimiro Romero was a shepherd, a transhumante shepherd from New Mexico, who had staked out the upper reaches of that canyon, and he and Goodnight came to an agreement. You take it from this point north, and I'll take the Paladero to the south and east. And so they just divided it up, They came up with a plan to settle the canyon. And so about the time he was moving there, or just before he left, he was introduced to John Adair, who was, people say English, but I think that's, Adair is an Irish name. In any case, Adair wanted to invest, so they became partners and founded the J.A. Ranch. And that was quite an enterprise. The advantage of the Paladero was that there was live water in it. You had one end of the canyon that you had to worry about keeping the cattle from drifting out of, and that was easy to patrol horseback. The walls of the canyon were so steep that you could only get down into it in a couple of places, and it was a very difficult thing to do. So you could hold the cattle easier there than you could in other places, and the canyon provided some shelter, from in the winter. So they were there 10 years, and he was very successful there. They were paying extraordinary interest rates on when they were using money. I mean, 10% compounded, which is almost like credit card rates, Yet he was able to return a substantial profit to Adair and himself. Adair died. He continued the arrangement for another couple of years, and I think it was another couple of years. And the widow was an American, Cornelia Adair. And so they split up things, and I think by all accounts, amiably, they split the herd up. She kept the ranch in the Paladero. Goodnight took some land up on top, which became the Goodnight Ranch, and then he got some land down by Kittiquay in Turkey, which he eventually sold off, and he began the Goodnight Ranch. Now, while they were on the Paladero, his wife, Mary Ann, had heard the constant gunfire slaughter of the buffalo, and she was really distraught by that, and so talked Goodnight into saving just a handful. I think the story is that there were 6 calves that their mothers had been killed in the slaughter, and she bottle fed them, and they began to raise these buffalo. And so Goodnight, although he had to be talked into it by Mary Ann, wound up becoming very fond of the buffalo, and that became a constant thing of his to first of all look at crossing buffalo and cattle so you could get the good of both. The buffalo were difficult to handle, but on the other hand, they never drifted during a storm. When they would get down during a really difficult norther, they would face themselves into the wind, whereas cattle would face away from the wind. And so they'd get drifted over, the cattle would, or they'd get drifted out and get tangled later on when there was barbed wire. The buffalo didn't do that. And Goodnight was quite convinced that buffalo were a superior animal. But, a buffalo is not a big woolly cow. It's a lot more like a big woolly antelope. They're very physical, they're fast, and they're fearless. They didn't have any natural predators other than maybe wolves, and they were well equipped to deal with wolves except for the ill and the very young. So the buffalo weren't easy to handle. So Goodnight went through most of his life interested in that notion that we can create what they called in those days cattle. In the 20th century, people began to call them beefalo, but then they called them cattle. So Mary Ann developed dementia and died. Goodnight moved off of the Goodnight Ranch and into Clarendon, and had met before that Corinne Goodnight from Montana. Corinne and her brother Tom had been orphaned in the flu epidemic in the teens, and they had read a story about this cattle rancher with the same last name, and so they wrote. She was the older, and she began writing him letters to see if they were, kinfolk, because here they were up in Montana, and they had no family except the two of them. And they decided they weren't kin. They didn't have any common connections, but she began to come. He invited them both to come down to visit, and they did. And then when Mary Ann died, Corinne was interested in his welfare, and he wasn't doing well. And she was a nurse. She was also engaged, and moved down to take care of him, and wasn't there very long before she renounced her engagement to this fellow in Montana. And lo and behold, she and Charlie Goodnight wed. He was 90 and she was 26, which that's quite a story in of itself. When he died 3 years later, at the age of 93, she was so struck by that emotionally that she suffered a case of temporary blindness from the psychosomatic blindness from the grief, and never remarried. Lived out the rest of her life alone. Her brother Tom settled in Arizona and became a very important person in the development of the Arizona banking industry, which is kind of interesting. He also tells stories of when he was a teenager, and Goodnight would have him drive him around in Arizona, and according to Tom, Goodnight Charlie, they were never going fast enough for Charlie in the car, and so he said Tom would say, that it scared him to death to be driving across the prairies, at that high rate of speed. But Goodnight was having none of slowing down.
In his wonderful book, Charles Goodnight, Cowman and Plainsman, J. Evetts Haley wrote this about the death of Charlie Goodnight. On the evening of the 11th, he ordered some coffee, sat up in bed, and drank it scalding from the cup, as he had done so many thousands of times before. Then he laid himself down upon his mattress, as hard as a cow camp bed, with his head on the special pillow, as unyielding as the seat of a saddle, and with the hot coffee warming his body, as his fiery spirit still warmed his soul, died just at saddling up time on the morning of December 12th, 1929. In the same chapter of the same book, Haley went on to say, "I can hardly believe that his own country understood the depths of his nature, the sturdiness of his character, or the caliber of the man."
He died in December of 1929 after having had a full meal of buffalo steak that had been sent out to him from his herd, or the remnants of his herd, and drinking a pot of coffee and smoking a big cigar, and he died that night. With those buffalo, one thing that's worth pointing out is not only did he save them, through moving into the Paladero, he met Quanah Parker, because Parker had surrendered himself to the U.S. Army and was on the reservation in Oklahoma. But as our government has so often done, they failed to live up to any agreement they had made with the native people in terms of providing cattle or any kind of food stuff. So they would often leave the reservation, and people would say they escaped, they'd broken out, but what they were doing was trying to go out and find something to eat. And the buffalo by this time had been killed off pretty much by the buffalo hunters. And so Goodnight struck a deal with Quanah Parker. It's a very well-documented meeting in the Paladero, and provided them beef cattle. Quanah Parker went on to become a real friend to not only Goodnight, but to Burke Burnett. When the Comanche reservation, they had a big area called the Big Pasture. They helped Burke Burnett through some really serious drought by letting him pasture his cattle on their land. In exchange, they got paid for it, but it was a really good deal. Goodnight also made friends with standing deer in the Taos Pueblo and gave them buffalo. There's still a herd of buffalo at Taos Pueblo, which is interesting. No one there seems to know that those buffalo came from Charlie Goodnight. He also had one of his nephews move out to near present-day Durango, or Mancos, actually, and ship some buffalo out there. So he was really active in moving these buffalo around and always trying to sell them. One of the other things that he did on the trail drive is he's credited for inventing the chuckwagon. Now, I'd mentioned that when they were working cattle as cowmen back before and during the Civil War, they would go out horseback and trying to work these cows, and they carried a little wallet, they called it, but it was like a rolled up a piece of leather that you could tie, and that you would put your food in that, some coffee, some bacon, some flour. And Goodnight, when they started moving these and having a large group of people, he came up with this idea to build a chuck box and put it on the back of a wagon. Now, we know that gypsies had been doing that for a long time, but at least in America it was the first known use of that technology. And so he gets the credit for having developed the chuck wagon. But he was a real student. He'd never gotten any past further than the third grade. And so when he dictated his letters all the rest of his life, he always had a secretary, a male secretary, as far as I know. And one of the great things that I found in doing research on him was that you could get a good sense of his language, because over all those different people taking dictation with different spelling and different handwriting and different punctuation and capitalization, there was still the same voice coming through. And so you know that was Goodnight's voice, which was a very cool thing to come about. Goodnight, while he had never could write very well, he couldn't spell at all, and it embarrassed him. He could read and read lots of magazines, and he was a very keen observer, particularly of the natural world. He'd, been out in it all his life. So he was interested in things like, can you crossbreed cattle? He was convinced, cattle and buffalo. He was convinced that you could cross pigs and cattle, or pigs and sheep. That's what it was, pigs and sheep. He was convinced that buffalo hide and tallow had physical properties that made them superior to things. And he would do tests. In fact, one interesting test that he did was he had a blanket spun out of pure buffalo fur, one blanket spun out of wool and half buffalo, and one that's all wool. And then he wrapped bottles of water in each of these blankets with the theory that the bottle wrapped only with wool would freeze first in the winter, the mixed second, and the buffalo last. And sure enough, that's what he reports as having happened. But he was familiar with the use of buffalo tallow for putting on like a poultice for wounds, and he swore that it had powers that other kinds of poultices didn't have, and based all that on his observations of things and what he learned from native people. So he was very, very interesting in that regard, and he was also this strange egalitarian person. When he finally was baptized after he had married Corinne, someone said, into what faith were you baptized? And he said, and I'll paraphrase it to eliminate the strong language he used. He says, well, I don't know, but you can bet it was a damn good one. And then he said, now this is curious, he followed that up right away by saying, besides, the only true religion is that of the Indian. Now, here's a guy that had been on the other end of the barrel for native people, throughout the Civil War, and sometimes on the trail drives. And so that's a pretty remarkable change, for a man. The other thing he said a little before that, this great book, Prose and Poetry of the Livestock Industry or the Cattle Industry, I can't remember the exact name. The piece on Goodnight is one of the best descriptions of him and his life. And he had opened and had to close Goodnight College in Goodnight, Texas, where his ranch was after he and the Adair split up. And he used to have the bell left over from the main building, of the administration building of that little college. And he would point to it and say, that bell's worth $75,000, because evidently that's what he lost on his adventure. But he lost the money because the school was free to men and women if they were the children of ranch hands or ranchers. And most of us can see that that's not much of a business model. But when he was talking about that in this interview that wound up in this prose and poetry piece, he said, if I could only educate one class of people, it would be the women. And he went on to explain that the women raise the children, and they have more impact on the character and strength of the children than does the father. And so that's who if he could only just spend money on educating one group, it'd be women. Now, this is 1890, I think. That's pretty remarkable when you think about that time period. That's also in that same interview is where he says, and I love this quote because of where I'm from, he said, the people of the plains will be forced to solve the problems of the people of the East. Because on the plains, a person has to see a great long distance, and such seeing makes the mind active. And then there's that beautiful quote, and then he launches into about a 3-paragraph diatribe about how the cowpunchers in the brush country in South Texas all turn out to be useless, shiftless, and of low moral character because they don't have to see a great long distance. So he kind of undid the beauty of his language afterwards. But I love that quote. So Goodnight, he was a really important creature in a lot of ways because he was one of those people that came out at a time when not very many people did come out, and because he was ecumenical, and I mean that in the sense that he, his relationship to Bose Eichard, with the Transhumante shepherds, with later the Comanche and the Taos Pueblans, and then his interest in women at a time when that just wasn't the case, and his dabbling, I say dabbling, it wasn't dabbling to him, his serious interest in the natural world and the science. Those are pretty remarkable, and I may be wrong, but I think Goodnight was less the epitome or the ideal of the people of that time, but probably just a better known case of what a lot of people were like then. You didn't wind up in places like that if you didn't have some metal to you, if you didn't have some substance. And I suspect there are a whole lot more of those folks out there that were a lot like Goodnight. And so to me, that's, he's in some ways a window into a way of living that would be a good thing for us to emulate. He wasn't afraid to use the gun. He was one of the ones who organized the Winchester quarantine when people were moving cattle from South Texas up north and they would have the fever. No one knew at that time how it came about. It was only much later. But he and other ranchers in the Panhandle said, well, we'll carve you out a path, and if you get off of it, we'll kill you. They didn't say that in so many words, but he said, I have a great number of well-armed men, and we will keep you, to that out of our ranges. And so he didn't shy away from that. Yet, as Laura Hamner said, he became known as the no-gun man of Texas because once something was settled, he said, we don't need to be carrying guns anymore. We need to be civilized, and we need to settle our differences in other ways. And so those are all things that seem paradoxical, and they certainly don't fit the blustery, nostalgic view that we have today of the history of the West. And I think that's not because he was so unusual, but because we are so blinded by the stereotypes created by Hollywood and 50s television and westerns that we can't see a much more complicated, a much more nuanced group of people of that time period.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'll pick up where I left off with Mr. Wilkinson on part 2 of our interview on the next episode. I'd like to thank Andy Wilkinson for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Andy at andywilkinson.org. I'd like to thank Flint Custom Hats for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Flint and order your own hat at flinthat.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. While you're there, you can sign up for my email list. If you're enjoying the show and would like to help support it, you could leave a rating and a review on the iTunes store, and you could take the time to tell a friend about the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.